Good evening. Welcome, everyone. I'm Jennifer Danlicker, President of the Carroll County League of Women Voters. We've been looking forward to the topic tonight that we have. Our presenters are professors, assistant professors from West Georgia. Both Dr. Anthony Fleming and Dr. Dylan McLean are associate professors in the Department of Civic Engagement and Public Service at the University of West Georgia. Both hold PhDs in political science. Dr. Fleming from the University of West Virginia, Dr. McLean from the State University of New York in Buffalo. At the University of West Georgia, the two have collaborated on the study of gun control policy in the United States, excuse me, including the reaction by policymakers, interest groups, the media, and the public to major gun violence events. Their research has culminated in a forthcoming book, Guns and Values, Individualism in the American Gun Debate, being published by Palgrave Macmillan. So thank you, doctors, for joining us tonight, and floor is yours.
All right, thank you all for having us. I appreciate it very much. I'm going to go ahead and get started here. My co-author is going to pick up in a little while. I just want to introduce our topic and discuss some of the ways that we approach this issue. So I always like to start these conversations by just reminding us really how distinct the United States is on this issue when it comes to guns and our relationship to guns in general. There are more than enough guns in the United States in private hands to arm every single American. That is by far an exceptional position, considering our role in the world. The guns are more prevalent here than anywhere else. The next country on the list in terms of per capita gun prevalence compared to the United States is actually Yemen, whereas the United States is about 120 guns per every 100 Americans. That number is not even half in Yemen. It's about 52 guns per every 100 Yemenis, and they're actively engaged in civil war. So I think that should tell you something about really just how common guns are here. We really do stand out. It really is an exceptional relationship. And I think it's noteworthy to remember that it always has been. Jamestown, there are enough guns there to harm every settler in Jamestown. There are always more guns in colonial America than there were in England. So this is not new. Obviously related to that, the US regulates guns far more liberally than every other comparable developed democracy does. So this is a really unique relationship, and it's worth close examination. So what we try to do is we try to help us better understand our relationship to guns by thinking about and really diving in critically to the debate that we have, the political debate about those guns and about how we regulate them. So what our research is, here's the bottom line up front, if you will. What our research has led us to conclude is that in order to understand the American gun debate, we have to understand it as fundamentally a debate about values, right? We can't simply understand the long-running debate about the role of guns in American society if we don't understand that that debate is a specific instance of a more general debate about the role of individualism in American life. So by individualism, what we really mean is a very classically liberal, expansive view of personal freedom and an embrace of self-reliance. And that individualism, we can really see driving opposition to gun control. On the other hand, we can see that gun control advocacy is rooted in a critique of what's perceived as an overly individualistic society. So therefore, we can think of the gun debate has a battle and a war over the influence of individualism on our policy. It's an argument that, in a nutshell, can pit private rights against public goods. So there are many ways we can see this, but there are three very specific ways, and they are interrelated. So first, we see cultural warfare and values influencing on an individual level how the problem of gun violence is understood to begin with, right? So questions like, what causes gun violence? Is it social failure? Is it individual failure? Is it a problem of gun access, or is it a problem of gun use? The answers to these questions on individual level are motivated and going to be rooted in a person's values. The second way, and obviously related to how we understand the problem of gun violence, are the types of policies that we propose and support to solve that problem, right? So we can group gun policies into three general categories. The first we can call lenient policy. Lenient policy essentially either tries to expand gun access through maybe permissive gun carry, or could simply be opposition to restrictive gun policy. So opposing possibly an assault weapons ban could be a lenient policy, opposing restrictive policy. The lenient policies we can see connected with values like individual freedom and a belief in self-reliance. And of course, lenient policies are generally associated with the gun rights side of this debate. Obviously, we have restrictive policies. Restrictive policies tend to either restrict gun access or regulate how guns can be accessed, among other things. They tend to be associated with values such as social responsibility, concern with the public welfare, and restrictive policies are obviously associated with gun control advocacy. The third type of policy is what we call punitive policy. So punitive gun policy focuses on punishing individuals for misusing guns. So punitive policy is typically going to be associated with values such as individual responsibility and individual accountability. Punitive policy is where we can see some overlap between the two camps, if you will, the two predominant sides of the gun debate. However, it generally is mostly associated with gun rights advocacy. And we can come back to that a little bit. So the third way, in addition to understanding, number one, how the problem of gun violence is understood, and number two, what policies we come up with to address that problem, we also see cultural warfare in the gun debate revealed in how those solutions are going to be sold to the public, how support is going to be built for them, right? So supporters of gun control, for example, will generally frame their arguments in communally oriented terms. They'll emphasize the well-being of the collective. They'll focus on the we and the our. On the other hand, arguments against gun control tend to focus on the well-being of individual members of that collective, and will use the language of individualism, the me. So for example, on the one hand, we may hear we need to control gun control to protect our children, our communities. On the other hand, we'll hear I need a gun to protect my family, my home. So the discourse of the gun debate shows that two primary sides of this debate understand the world in fundamentally different ways. That's incredibly key to our work. Gun rights advocates, gun control advocates have very different views of the world. And this is why it can seem that they're often talking past one another. It isn't simply that one side's arguments fail to persuade people on the other side. It's rather the case that each side simply can't even comprehend the sensibility or even the premise of the other's argument. They just don't resonate. Right? Somebody who fundamentally prioritizes me, mine, mine is not going to be persuaded by arguments that emphasize we, us, and ours. So let's think about an example that's loosely based on some of the interviews we did to really try to understand how this would work on an individual level. Right? So we've all heard statistics and technical arguments in the gun debate. So many of you have maybe heard arguments that some statistics demonstrating that permissive gun laws can be associated with increased crime, right? Well, somebody who sincerely believes that they have a personal right to carry a gun for protection is not going to change their mind based on statistics showing that guns, which they believe they should have, can actually contribute to crime. Their mind will not be changed because their view is based on a sincerely and deeply held value proposition. On the other hand, someone who firmly believes that guns in a community pose risks to people in that community is not going to be swayed by a study that shows that concealed carry may actually deter criminals. So evidence that more guns may reduce crime is not going to persuade somebody who fundamentally believes that guns pose a danger to the community. These technical arguments will not move people from value-informed positions. Values are deeply held and resistant to change. So we have, in the first sense, rights, maybe a sense of I will protect me and mine, an individual responsibility. Maybe on the other hand, we'll have society is responsible for protection. The police are responsible for protection, social responsibility. But when the fundamental, often unspoken difference is about what we value, or even just value generally, arguments that don't actually address those values will not be persuasive. So one of the major things that we did for our research was interview a significant section, cross-section of activists, people who actively work on these issues and seek change, either to expand gun rights or conversely to resist gun control, or to increase gun control, so gun control or gun safety advocates. These are people with deeply and sincerely held issues that have thought about these things in a very serious way. So it is abundantly clear to us from these interviews that although often under the surface, that all of their views are motivated by cultural orientations, and those cultural orientations are representative of contrasting interpretations of individualism and how it should influence and inform policy. So they clearly understand the world very different. So the gun rights side of the coin, very, very heavily focused on the individual's perspective, the private realm, the me, the my, right? My rights, my family. Gun control, on the other hand, those advocates are very extensively use the language of community, public, our, society. I'll give you a good example. Several activists from both camps drew on cars as an analogy to illustrate some of their points. Right. So the gun rights activists, to begin with, they generally favored policies that maximize individual freedom in this realm and focused on punishing people who misuse those freedoms. So lenient and punitive policies. So one, for example, argued that some types of cars can be more dangerous than others. And they said, well, hey, we don't limit the availability of vehicles based on how dangerous they may be if they're misused. So what we do is we punish individuals who misuse those vehicles, right? Some cars can go easy to take really fast, and what we do is punish people who speed or drive recklessly. Another applied this logic to driving while intoxicated. He argued that we don't ban alcohol, we don't ban vehicles. What we do is we punish people who drink alcohol while driving vehicles. So again, those views are very emblematic of an individual-centric lens on the world. Think about the gun control activists, on the other hand. What they did was they also sought to illustrate their views by discussing cars, but instead of relying on individual preference and behavior, they drew on the common good as a justification for restrictive policy. So one of our interviewees was actually a car enthusiast and he drives a particular car because he really likes it. He says it's cool, he likes it, very interested in vehicles. So we said, these arguments that you're making, many gun rights activists use the same language to describe the guns that they choose to own. They don't necessarily have a need. Maybe they just want them. They like them. So we asked him, well, how would you react if someone banned this car that you very much like? And he responded by saying, well, it depends why. He says, we banned the sale of assault rifles because there's been such a social cost to them. If you told me that you could no longer buy a new car that pollutes and gets 3 miles to the gallon, because it's a detriment to the greater good, he said, I'd be all right with that. His worldview emphasized the greater good, and he's able to make the connection that personal sacrifice is acceptable for the greater good. That simply would not resonate with the other side of this debate. Well, another important aspect of the debate that we touched on with our interviewees, and we're just giving a general overview here, was the idea that in the United States, one of the things that makes the American relationship with guns unique around the world is guns often have a very symbolic value in the US. They mean non-intrinsic things to many people. They're value bearers rather than simply objects. This is particularly true, obviously, for gun enthusiasts and the gun rights activists. Well, for many of the gun rights activists, guns are often viewed as cherished symbols of core American values. Right? The value of the gun goes far beyond whatever its practicality is, whatever it would actually be used for, whether that's recreation or defense or sport. And it's noteworthy here that this isn't something that's necessarily seen on the front end. So what I mean by that is, it isn't necessarily the case that a gun owner goes to a sporting goods store and buys a shotgun so they can enhance their sense of freedom. They may go buy that for the sporting purposes of it. When this non-intrinsic value of gun owning becomes activated is when there's a threat to these things. Then they have a much deeper association with the non-intrinsic value, the freedom or the individualism, the self-reliance that the gun will represent to them. Why this is important in the policy debate about guns is, to these gun owners and these gun rights activists, attempts to regulate the object get interpreted as regulating the value that that object represents. So now you're not just talking about taking away a physical object, you're talking about taking away someone's freedom, for example. That introduces a higher level of complexity into this debate. For gun control activists, this logic just simply does not resonate. It's completely incomprehensible to them. They assume that guns are, to those who own them, are merely tools. They're simply objects that are used for a purpose. The idea that they could be anything more is just simply non-resonant. So what's the key? What's this mean? It means this is not just a policy dispute, right? These two groups fundamentally disagree about what the ideal society is. Fundamentally, they have different visions of what makes a good society. What type of world do we want to live in? The gun rights activists, they're rugged individualists in the classic sense. They believe in powerful citizens and weak government. These gun rights activists express a view of the world that's highly individualistic. They cherish personal responsibility, self-reliance, individual freedom. They want policies that reflect and foster these values. The rugged individualism that they express is characteristic of traditional conceptions of American political culture. And this is significant because that gives them advantages in the broader gun debate. The gun control activists, on the other hand, view themselves as members of a society. Their worldview was less individualistic, and they were much more comfortable thinking about the world in terms of groups or communities. They embrace the idea that individual rights must be balanced with the needs of community, of the group, of the public, of the collective. Their emphasis is on the public good, not the private rights. Gun control advocates want to be part of a robust society with a government that supports individuals. The gun rights advocates want to live in a world comprised of self-reliant individuals who are governed in a manner that maximizes individual freedom. Now, quickly, before I hand it off to my partner, Dr. Fleming, I'll note that, hey, we're interviewing activists here. Are these folks necessarily representative of the average gun owner? We're not arguing that. What we are arguing is that the folks that we interviewed for this project are driving the debate, and they're very much in tune with those average gun owners, those average non-gun owners, and they have to structure their arguments to resonate with them. So we're not necessarily arguing that these folks are representative of some broader population other than activists, but we're arguing that it's important to understand where they're coming from, because they've thought about these issues a great deal. They're passionate about these issues, and they need to make their arguments in a way that is actually going to resonate in a broader sense. So with that, I'm glad to hand it off to Dr. Fleming.
Hello, everyone. I appreciate you all coming out this evening. So before I launch into my portion of the book, I'm going to provide a little bit of backstory. Dr. McLean and I have both been interested in firearms policy for most of our academic careers. We each have published before, but on firearms policy. What's interesting, though, is he and I have approached the issue from different angles historically. I've been much more of an institutional person, looking at why government behaves the way that it does at the macro level, looking at Congress and presidents. And he's been much more at the individual level, looking at culture. And we've debated this over the years, and then we realized that we weren't really at odds with each other. We were complementary to one another. So this led us to this book project. So with that being said, what my part of the book is, I read essentially every New York Times article from 1960 through 2016 that dealt with presidents or Congress or interest groups talking about firearms. I also read essentially every presidential statement on firearms through that same time period. And I had a 100,000 word document combining all of that together. And then we condensed that down to about 30,000 more concise words to tell the stories of presidents from Kennedy up through Obama. Now, obviously, President Trump and President Biden not included in this at this point in time. And that's not because we don't want to, but access to the data, it tends to take it a little while for them to upload presidential statements. So I'm kind of waiting on those to get there. So if you ask why is Trump not included or Biden's not included, that would be why. All right, so presidents, much like people and activists and their administrations, have varied quite a bit on their interest in tackling gun policy and on their side. So we started with really Johnson. Johnson was very interested, or President Lyndon Johnson was very interested in gun control policy, and particularly limiting and restricting mail order firearms, because the president he was VP for, President Kennedy, was shot and killed with an Italian rifle that was obtained through the mail. So this led to Johnson pushing, starting about 1965, for the Gun Control Act, which would stop the interstate sale of firearms, some record keeping with ammunition. And he really had a hard time making strides with it. And then in 1966, Charles Whitman, one of your first true infamous mass murder events in the observation tower at the University of Texas, Johnson tried to use this as momentum to get the Gun Control Act passed. And then in 1968, you have the assassination of Martin Luther King, and you have the assassinations of Robert F. Kennedy. And the mass murders and assassinations finally got Johnson over the top in 1968 to get the Gun Control Act passed. Now, He then immediately called for registration of all firearms and licensing, but this didn't happen. It failed. In Johnson's farewell address, he said that one of his biggest regrets as president was not being able to get more gun control passed. He tried, but was unsuccessful. Johnson was followed by Nixon. Now, Nixon was apathetic towards firearms. He wasn't that interested in them in a lenient way, a punitive way, or a restrictive way. He basically didn't want anything to do with firearms. They weren't his topic of interest. Then Watergate arises, and then the only thing that he cared about was staying in office. So gun policy goes to the wayside. Now he is replaced by President Gerald Ford. Now Ford is interesting because he talks a lot about what are called Saturday night specials. And Saturday night specials are still hear talk about them from time to time. A Saturday night special is a cheap handgun that you could buy at that time for 20 bucks, made of cheap material, cheap ammunition. And most people argued that the only really were good for was murder. Leonard Skinner wrote a song at that time called Mr. Saturday Night Special, which basically talks about the ills of Saturday night specials. If you are familiar, you may have heard the song, and that's exactly what they're saying. This is about that time frame too. A sales pitch for gun control. Now, and Ford also suffers 2 attempted assassinations attempts, and both of those were with people who have Saturday night specials. Now he wasn't hit, he wasn't wounded or anything like that. Now, as his presidency advanced, and it was very short, he went from being kind of restrictive, kind of punitive. He didn't really have a clear message. And then he realized he wanted to be reelected. So then he became, we got to protect gun rights. We got to protect gun rights the last 6 months or so of his presidency. But ultimately he failed. Now, some people say, well, was it the gun issue that made him fail, or was it the fact that he pardoned Nixon? Probably the latter, and not his somewhat waffling on the gun policy. After Ford, you had Jimmy Carter. Now, Carter was interesting because Carter campaigns on gun registration. He discusses that's implementing some restrictive policy. However, while in the presidency, he barely touches on the topic. Much like Nixon, he's apathetic. Gun policy is not something that interests Carter. However, his opponent in the 1980 election, President Reagan, or future President Reagan, in one of his campaign speeches says, going with Dr. McLean talks about with the I's versus the we's and ours, President Reagan says, I don't happen to be one who believes that making it more difficult for law-abiding citizens to get firearms, you're going to stop crime. So when Reagan is elected, in his first part of his presidency, he is shot and wounded in an assassination attempt. You would think that this would make him anti-firearms. However, it does not. Reagan frequently uses being shot in Washington, D.C. as a clear indication of the failure of the firearm laws in D.C. He said, you know, you have all these laws in place, some of the most restrictive laws in the country, and it didn't stop this young man from shooting me walking out of a building. So if gun control laws are going to stop crime, why didn't it stop me from getting shot? He also was the first president to go and speak at the annual National Rifle Association convention. The NRA in the early 1980s considered this one of their greatest landmark achievements, having a sitting president come and speak. Shortly, and then during Reagan's presidency in 1986, you get the passage of the Gun Owners Protection Act, sometimes called the Firearm Owners Protection Act, which essentially voided what was accomplished in the Gun Control Act of 1968. Now, one thing that's interesting about Reagan is he's very consistent that he is anti-gun control until his last statement after he's been defeated, or not defeated, but his term runs out, where he says, maybe we should consider some gun control. And a lot of people think that the reason that he made this argument is a nod to his press secretary, Brady, James Brady, who was shot and wounded. And the Brady campaign, which was created by Brady's wife, became the leading interest group proposing and pushing for gun control in the United States. So Reagan is very consistent until his very last statement, where he, instead of being lenient, he now pushes and makes a restrictive argument, which is fairly interesting. Reagan is then replaced by George H.W. Bush. And President Bush, for me, was probably one of the first Bush, was probably the most frustrating to read as I was writing him. Dr. McLean actually commented that he could tell that I get annoyed when I was writing about Bush. Bush had no consistent messaging. He waffled all over the place. One day he would be restrictive in his arguments. One day he would be lenient. One day he would be punitive. And sometimes he would say it all in one speech, in one paragraph. So how I labeled him was he was consistently inconsistent. He alienated both sides. It took him no time for gun control advocates and gun rights advocates to be completely incensed with him and call him out for no clear messaging. It took until right near his reelection that he started consistently aligning with lenient and punitive positions, but ultimately he was not able to defeat Clinton in the election. I don't know if it was his inconsistency with firearms or potentially making comments such as "read my lips, no new taxes," but George H.W. Bush, very inconsistent in his messaging. President Clinton is extremely interesting because he is the one president after Johnson who has gun control as a primary policy issue. Clinton really wants society to be safer. And Clinton does something that other gun control advocates haven't done in the past, is he reframes the debate. He says that we got to keep our children safe. And really, before Clinton, you don't have a whole lot of conversation about making society safer for our children. And this leads to a little bit of soul searching by the gun rights advocates. They don't really know how to tackle this at first, which leads to Clinton to having a few successes early in his presidency. He gets the Brady bill passed, which is the waiting period. Then he gets the assault weapons ban passed. Now, one thing that makes interesting about the assault weapons ban is it banned 19 different types of assault rifles, but it also protected guns that couldn't be targeted with any gun control legislation, like 270. It was a very large number of guns were exempted, but there was only 19 that were banned. I think it was, oh, I'm sorry, I'm drawing a blank. There was a minority leader of the Senate right now from New York. Oh, well, I can't remember his name right off the top, man, I apologize. But he made a comment while he was still in the House of Representatives. He said, quote, "This goes to demonstrate to you that there is life after voting against the NRA." And then in 1994, after this famous quote by him, the Democrats get crushed in the 94 election in the Republican Revolution when Newt Gingrich, former University of West Georgia history teacher, becomes the Speaker of the House. So Clinton never really is able to overcome that massive defeat and what Clinton does after losing in 94 is he doesn't take any accountability. He says the reason we lost this election is because of the NRA. Well, the NRA doesn't say, "Oh no, we feel so bad about this." The NRA takes this and runs with it. And it makes Democrats very scared to touch the gun control issue because they see it as a non-winner. If you go after guns, you might lose your job and you may not get anything passed anyway. So what incentive do you have to go after guns? So Clinton, by making this comment, gives the Republicans a lot of street cred, and it gives the NRA a lot of street cred, and it makes Democrats unwilling really to tackle guns. Now, after Clinton is reelected, he continues to pursue firearms legislation. After Columbine, which took place my senior year in high school, I remember it well. He really pushed for more gun controls. He speech after speech, calling for we, protecting our society, doing whatever he could to try to make changes, and he could not sway Congress to move on any form of gun control. So Clinton, after he leaves office, is replaced by George W. Bush. George Bush II was not terribly interested in guns, and he quickly focused everything after September 11th on foreign policy. One thing that happened during George Bush's presidency, which he never spoke on record about, but which went through Congress, and surprisingly with little fanfare by news coverage, is there was a law passed in 2005 that prevents firearms manufacturers from being sued for their weapons causing harm. So they have special protection, because what the firearms industry realized is that they didn't want to go the way of the tobacco industry, where their products led to billions of dollars. So they went to Congress and gave themselves a special exemption. So firearms manufacturers, and this still holds true today, cannot be sued because of their products causing harm. So that happened during George W. Bush's presidency. Now, lastly, we have President Obama. What's interesting about Obama is for his first 4 years of his presidency, he wanted nothing whatsoever to do with gun control. He didn't talk about it. He was called out constantly by members of Congress. His spokespeople would say, you know, President Obama is going to eventually have an address on this. He is thought of as a really strong gun control advocate, which he became after Sandy Hook, after he was reelected. But his first term of his presidency, he didn't want anything to do with guns. And he made a comment, I think near the end of his presidency, that said something along the lines of, me as president has sold more guns than anyone. Because anytime you had a mass shooting, people would think Obama's going to come for my guns. And they would go out and buy guns and ammunition. After Sandy Hook, I was called by CNN and they wanted me to do an interview, which I declined because I couldn't speak with it with any guarantee. But they said, we want to know why police stations are running out of the ability to buy ammunition. They can't buy ammo anywhere. It's all gone. And they said, what do you think's happened? I said, my guess is that people think that President Obama is going to pass legislation that's going to take their guns. So they all went out and bought all the ammo they could. And Obama seemed to realize this as well, because of his comments that he was one of the best salesmen ever for firearms owners or for firearms manufacturers. So President Obama didn't really push hard for gun control during his presidency. After Sandy Hook, he created a commission with Vice President Biden, and he came up with a number of executive orders. I know a lot of people who are on the gun rights side were upset with the orders, but essentially the president's executive orders, if you look at them, was apply the laws that we already have on the books better. We need to do a better job. And it wasn't really that substantive of nature. He advocated for common sense gun control, but it really wasn't one of President Obama's top priorities. All right. Now, I don't have data on Trump besides saying that he spoke at multiple national rifle conventions and was seemingly very pro-gun. However, after Parkland, he made the comment of just seizing guns and basically to hell with due process. So while he spoke at the NRA national conventions, he also made comments that came off as very pro-control at times. So President Trump had some inconsistencies there. And President Biden, based on his record with Obama, would suggest that he would be interested in gun control. However, there hasn't been much evidence of him really pursuing that up to this point. At this point, I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. McLean, who probably has a few more points to add. Maybe I missed something. Dr. McLean.
All right, thank you. So I'll just give some overarching themes and some conclusions and maybe some policy implications of our work. What you see really from the overview and how we connect the bottom end of our work, we're looking at the grassroots activists and this higher level Washington, D.C. policy debate that Dr. Fleming is just overviewed. I mean, it's a 90,000 word book. so we just gave an overview of, is we see in how these legislators, these lobbyists, these presidents, when they argue for or against gun control, they use the same language that our activists use. They talk about our communities, noted with Clinton, right? That's let's protect our children. President Obama talked about, common sense gun safety to protect our children and our communities. And the other interesting thing we see about taking this, 20th century into the 21st century overview is periods where individualistic sentiment is on the wane or on the rise. It can be correlated with legislative activity on this issue. So individualistic sentiment in the US and in American culture is not a constant, it's a variable, it ebbs and flows. So a period like the 1960s, when President Johnson's Great Society program is taking advantage of a rather high watermark in community-oriented public sentiment, we also see the Gun Control Act passed into law. On the other hand, for example, in the 80s, where we have a very individualistic era that gets taken advantage of, and some of the provisions of the Gun Control Act of the 1960s get rolled back in the Firearm Owners Protection Act, which Reagan signed into law. So we see these grassroots cultural orientations being reflected in the policy debate. So speaking of that policy debate, there are many, many people who have strong feelings on this issue and that want to see change one way or another. The reality is the anti-control side, the what's commonly known as the gun rights side, historically has been advantaged in the policy debate. And a big reason for that advantage is it's much easier for them to frame their arguments in ways that have a broader resonance in American political culture. It's easier to frame resistance to gun control, the individualistic lens that's going to have broad resonance. Gun control advocates have to appeal to a sense of common good, right? But they also have to recognize that their goals restrict individual rights and attack personal values. And in the United States, those are things that are held in pretty high regard, right? So we're sensitive to that. We do restrict private rights. Of course, we have legislation, we have laws that do restrict private rights and do restrict individual freedom. And enacting those has been very difficult. Enacting gun control and restricting guns is even more difficult because we're talking about guns, we're talking about something that in American history and culture is emblematic of those values themselves, right? So in the US, it isn't just that our prevailing bias toward individuals makes regulating guns hard. It's also the reality that for many people, guns actually represent those political values. So when we talk about gun control, we aren't just talking about regulating objects. We're talking about regulating values. So what's the policy implication? The policy implication is for those gun safety, for those gun control advocates, first and foremost, they need to do a better job recognizing that and using it to their advantage, incorporating it into their strategy. Right? Gun control advocates would benefit from fully appreciating the values environment that they're operating in. And they're actually starting to do this. We've seen some fairly significant changes within about the past 10 years in the way that gun control advocates seek policy change. First and foremost, you hear a lot less about gun control, and you hear a lot more about gun safety or common sense gun laws, right? The common sense was a very much popularized by President Obama. The other thing that they really need to do, and they're starting to do, is shift their strategy from selling to selling from telling, right? Americans like to be sold and oftentimes need to be sold to do things. Americans are very naturally resistant to being told to do things, right? think about the anti-smoking campaign, right? Smoking has declined precipitously over the past few decades and generationally for sure. We haven't banned cigarettes, but education, slow cultural change, slow but persistent cultural change has dramatically decreased smoking. And a lot of that's through educational exposure on the harms caused by smoking, right? So if you think about how could that be applied to a gun safety agenda, right? Instead of focusing on trying to restrict, they would be wise to shift some resources to gun safety, public relations, educating. So rather than safe storage or child access issues, for example, rather than advocating mandating safe standards and maybe punishing individuals or parents, for example, who don't store, maybe in addition to, or maybe instead of, put some resources into creating a culture and educating on the needs for safe storage. And you can incorporate individual rights and responsibility into this. How about the phrase, rights come with responsibilities, right? Frame it as individual responsibility. Look, yes, it's your individual right to own a gun. It's your individual responsibility to lock that gun up, right? Another thing they need to take away, bans, straight up bans of any sort are going to be alienating, are going to stoke controversy, and are going to be counterproductive, right? Anything that can be framed as a ban is going to be dangerous territory for the long-term agenda of the gun safety community. Have to be very careful with that. They're starting to recognize this. So one of the leading gun safety organization right now is Everytown for Gun Safety. There are several, but arguably the leading one is Everytown for Gun Safety. Grew out of some of the Newtown families. On their website and their solutions page, they have a very extensive list of their policy priorities. The very, very bottom of that list is where you have to go to find the first mention of bans that they support. Assault weapons ban, for example, high capacity magazine ban. So they still want these things. But what's at the top? What are their high priorities? And their talking points, if you watch legislatures saying their talking points, they won't even mention the bans anymore. Background checks on gun sales, federal red flag laws. They actually cite reducing police violence. They argue police violence is gun violence. Promoting responsible gun ownership is on their website. So they're starting to pick up on some of these things that they need to make arguments that have more resonance in the more predominant values dimensions that are out there in the American population. So that's the policy that this boils down to. If you're going to advance, you need to have some cultural resonance. Last thing I'll say is just briefly on the topic of bans, as we do still see advocacy for bans, and a lot of the politicians, you see it actually less from the policy experts, if you will, the advocacy groups like Everytown. You see it more from politicians because bans still resonate with the base. So you see President Biden advocating for assault weapons bans. He recognizes that is very much not on the table right now politically, but for a Democratic base, that's still a very popular policy. But policies tend to be sticky, right? The policy preferences like that tend to be sticky. They're not easily changed. But the experts in this, Everytown, Giffords, they're learning that they need to dial some of that rhetoric down a little bit in order to advance their broader agenda. So with that, if we have any time left, maybe we can take some questions or we can wrap it up, but I'm happy to hand the floor back over. And we really appreciate the opportunity.
I have a question that has been submitted, and it has a little background with it before we get to the question. And this has to do with the CDC and gun violence research. The last sitting CDC director to make strong public statements about gun violence was Dr. David Satcher, who served in the position from 1993 to 1998. The CDC did do gun violence research until 1997, when the NRA convinced Congress to cut all of the CDC's funding for gun research, a loss equivalent to millions of dollars a year. In 2018, President Donald Trump signed a government spending bill that allowed the CDC to conduct gun violence research, but he then proposed budget cuts that basically took that away. In 2021, Congress agreed to millions of dollars for gun violence research for the first time in decades, allowing $25 million split between the CDC and the U.S. National Institutes of Health to research the causes, effects, and solutions of gun violence. Dr. Rochelle Walentz, current CDC director, said much of CDC's research will be engaged in understanding the root causes of gun violence. She wants the gun owners to be part of the conversation. They are approaching the issue by addressing the ways which work to prevent gun deaths and injuries, short of making guns more difficult to possess. It seems to concentrate on programs to educate people on handling guns rather than on how to decrease the number of guns. And the question is, what will be the importance of the CDC research on gun violence in the future now that they are back in the game? What do you think their influence will be?
So I'll start. I guess if Dr. Fleming wants to add anything, he's welcome to. I'm going to be rather pessimistic and say that I think their research would have very little impact on this debate because the debate is largely immune to persuasion. It's just not clear to me throughout any of this work that there's much evidence that there is a persuadable middle on these issues. So evidence can be used to persuade. There are studies. So the CDC has been out of the game, but there has been plenty of research that's been conducted both from the public health perspective, from the criminological perspective, from the sociological perspective, from political science. There's been research conducted on this topic. Advocacy groups have conducted research. There's no shortage of statistics on this issue. What there is a shortage of are persuadable individuals. Those numbers are used to simply in a circular way to support pre-existing beliefs. If Dr. Fleming has anything to add, he's welcome, but that's Spencer.
Yeah, so there's a book written by a professor, I think she's still at Duke, by the name of Kristen Goss. I heard it's called Disarmed. It's probably a little bit dated now, but she's really interesting because she talks about the CDC and the politics behind why or what happened to them in the first place. And that is looking at the NRA and how the NRA is operated. And she talks about what she calls the 3 Ds. I forget what the third D is, but the one I'm going to use is functionally the same. She said what the NRA does when they attack someone is they first go for defunding them, then they delegitimize them, and then essentially they go ahead and try to finish them off or destroy them. And what happened with the CDC was, and it took the NRA a second to catch on, was they were talking about gun violence as a public health issue. And they started realizing that public health is something that could gain momentum, that could hurt their cause, which is why the CDC got defunded this first go round. So I think the CDC will do similar style work. I also think that they were doing back in the early 90s, whenever they were talking about it as a public health crisis. I also think that if the NRA is still as effective as they have been, and I think that the discussion of the NRA's demise is greatly overstated. When you get a more right-leaning administration, the effectiveness of the CDC and its funding for gun control research will likely go down. But to echo what Dr. McLean is arguing is that facts, this is may frustrate, but facts don't always matter in this debate. And it goes back, I think it was Chris Cox, who I forget, it was with the NRA. I think he was the chief lobbyist at the time, but he made a comment once. He said, you know, when you approach us like we're one of the great religions of the world, because what we're representing is people care about it essentially so much as they do faith. And a lot of the research that we see on gun policy is trying to say, you know, it's one of our arguments that we make in the book. Really, Dr. McLean is who really sold me on it, and I fully agree, is there's a lot of research talks about the myth of the violent West, the Wild West. It's a myth. The cowboy as the quintessential example of America, that's a myth. But it doesn't matter, because that's what people believe. It doesn't matter if it's a myth. And so much of what political scientists that we've studied do is focus on, well, that's a myth. It's a myth. It's not true. But you're not going, it's like finding a book or writing a book that says, it doesn't matter what you believe about being Christian, it's not true because it's a myth. It's not going to change people's minds because it's a belief. So the myth is important. And it's so important that if you look in 2008 in the DC versus Heller case, when Antonin Scalia writes the opinion, his opinion is that myth. So he cites things that aren't necessarily factual, but it ties into the myth. It's what's been cultivated. And people will point out, I can't believe Scalia said that. I can't believe it because it's not true. It's a myth, but it doesn't matter. It's the myth and the religion around it. It's hard to overcome. And when you try to go to a gun rights person and you say, well, these are the facts. It's like going to someone who's a devout Christian and say, these are the facts that prove God doesn't exist. And are they going to change their mind? So back to the original question about the CDC. They can produce evidence, but is that going to sway the gun rights activists? I don't think so.
Paul Lucan has a question.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. First off, thank you both very much. I really appreciate everything you said. And I have one observation. I might be wrong. I want you to correct me if I am wrong, because I think that the manufacturer of the gun that was used in Sandy Hook was successfully sued, not for manufacture though, but for the advertising of the weapon. Do you know if could I be correct or if I'm wrong about that?
So that is correct. And the case went back and forth in the courts precisely because of the Protecting Lawful and Commerce in Arms law, to find a way that under that law it could still be sued. And you're correct, they did target the advertising as encouraging deviant behavior, illegal behavior, rather than the product itself. So they found a way, and that model has been replicated with mixed levels of success.
Okay. One other thing, because I do think that there is another really powerful voice in this debate that, and almost shuts off the debate sometimes, it seems, and that's the U.S. Supreme Court. And especially as in preparation for tonight's talk, I read a little article by former Justice Stevens, who was highly critical of the 2008 decision, because the Supreme Court up until then thought that the Second Amendment was basically about the malicious. You know, it had nothing to do with individual rights to have guns. And all that got thrown out the window in 2008. And I think that has done, you know, a lot to really change things. And I think it's making it, in this current Supreme Court is making it all the more difficult on any level to have any type of gun regulation. But it almost seems like what people think is becoming irrelevant, that because the court has become such a powerful player in this at this moment. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So what's interesting, there's a book, it's actually written by the Cato Institute, and they're the ones who were the key lobbyists behind DC versus Heller. And if you look into it, you'll see that case was manufactured by the Cato Institute. They went looking in DC for someone who met the criteria that would Heller was a security guard who could carry a gun on duty, but he couldn't have a gun to protect his home. And that was the person that they needed. And I think they vetted like 17 different people. What's interesting, though, is the biggest opponent to them going to trial was the NRA. The NRA tried to stop them. They were scared to death of the case going. Because what the NRA realized was, and this is how they've always operated, it is easier and safer to get legislators in your pocket and control the legislative debate than it is to go to the court. Because once it goes to the court, it's a wild card, because they then change the meaning of everything with a decision. So the NRA, if you read this book, it's fairly short, and it's clearly one-sided, but they talk about how they meet with NRA lawyers, and NRA lawyers are trying to, like, they're actually sending motions to try to not let it happen. They're trying like hell to kill it. So then the NRA realizes that it's going to go to trial, that it's going to side in their favors. Then they start piling on at the end. But the NRA really didn't want that court to go, or that case to go to trial. They try to stay and work within the legislature, because they've always been able to find veto points. And that, to me, is one of the, what I said earlier about institutions, and why I look at the institutional debate, is in the United States, if you have one legislature in a key position, you can shut the entire thing down. And there used to be a guy, I'm bad with names, and it's been a long day, I've been in a bunch of meetings, but there used to be a guy who was on the executive council of the NRA, and he was from Michigan, and he was also the chairman of the Judiciary Committee. So any gun control law would come to him, and he would kill it. And he was asked once, and I won't say what he said verbatim, but he was asked once by a gun rights activist or gun control activist, and they're like, we come up with common sense policy that can really do something good, and you won't comply, we won't do anything with it. And he says, well, you can write policy all day, as long as I write procedure, I am going to screw you over every time. And he was much more colorful in his description. But his argument was, we have a lockdown, so never going to get past it. You'd have to take a discharge petition to get around him, and to get a discharge petition in the House of Representatives is essentially impossible. It rarely ever happens. So that's why the NRA likes to work in the legislative realm, where they can lobby, they can get access point. When you get into the Supreme Court, where lobbying isn't as guaranteed, because you don't have to worry about re-election in the Supreme Court, they start getting a little more nervous about legislation, because the last major Supreme Court case before DC versus Heller on firearms was in like 1934. And so it had been a minute. So they didn't really want to go there because they were afraid. And then, well, as a nutshell, just to, if you don't know, DC versus Heller says that owning a firearm is an individual right. And then in 2010, McDonald versus Chicago, you get the decision that the firearms is an individual right, and it applies to the states. So it's not just federal policy, it is federal policy and state policy. And that is a big deal, because that's when the Second Amendment gets incorporated into the Constitution. And before that, states had a lot of leniency on how they pass policy. Like even one of the, talking about that a little bit, Kennesaw, I don't know if it's still in place. If you're a Kennesaw resident, you're supposed to have a gun in city limits. And that was in response to 3 cities in Illinois that banned owning a gun in city limits. So that was taking place in the 80s. So, but what the NRA did after the 3 cities in Illinois, they used Dillon's rule when they went to the states. Before the 3 townships in Illinois had banned guns, the first one was Morton Grove. There are only like 7 states that had Dillon's rule in effect. And Dillon's rule is local jurisdictions are essentially at the mercy of the state. And if the state says you can't pass a certain type of law, you can't touch it. So Dillon's rule, only 7 states couldn't pass gun control level at the state level. The NRA got involved, and in 5 years, that number went from 7 states to 43 that banned local gun restrictions. And that was because the NRA realized, we can win in Congress, but if we lose at the state level, it functionally is the same. So they went after this at the state level to get victories. They didn't go to the local level because there's some 100,000 local governments in the United States, but they can get a lock on the 50. So I'm sorry, that goes well beyond the Supreme Court, but it all kind of ties together in a way. Dr. McLean, do you have anything like to add to that?
If we have just briefly, in political science there's large consensus that the Supreme Court, although it bills itself as a legal institution, is the political institution. It just is a slower political institution than our other ones, right? Change happens much more quickly in the legislative branches and the executive branches than the Supreme Court. Well, nonetheless, it's a political institution. Fundamentally, what we find and what we're trying to frame our argument around is the idea that these cultural elements, these value orientations, they're upstream, if you will, of the political institutions and orientations. So eventually these cultural value orientations, they find their way into the political institutions, which will ultimately, it just takes longer, include the Supreme Court.
Yeah, that to me can be seen as Scalia's argument, because what happens is the NRA really starting in like the 1960s starts saying it's your God-given right to own a gun. It's your God-given right to own a gun. It's your God-given right to own a gun. And they say it again and again and again. And it goes into the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and then it gets into and then you see Scalia basically citing NRA language from the last 50 years and talking about cultural arguments. It's, to me, his opinion, while maybe not based in fact, it captures a lot of what we're talking about very well.
Thank you, Dr. McLean and Dr. Fleming, for this information. We have looked forward to this very much, this discussion that we're having here. And we also need to know when your book will be out and if we can buy it here in Carrollton somewhere.
Well, we would like to know that as well. We haven't, it's in the final stage of review. We haven't had our production timeline given to us yet, but we're hoping it will be out this year, and we'll have more information on the availability later. But
Okay, well, let us know.
thank you.
I have a couple of announcements. Great Decisions, our Great Decisions lecture series starts February 2nd. And this is the first time since the pandemic that we have been meeting back in person again. So the first discussion will be war crimes, and the lecture will be presented by Dr. Kathy Barrett at 6 o'clock at the West Georgia United Methodist Church on Maple Street. So hope to see you all there. I put in the chat how to order your briefing book. You can get it as a printed book or an ebook. And so that information's in the chat for you to get. Also, February 14 is coming up. That is a very important date, always every year, especially for League members. February 14th is the League's birthday, and the League will be 103 years old, February 14th. So everybody keep that in mind. Does anybody have any other announcements? Well, if not, with that, we'll say good night. Good night, everybody.
Thank you.
Good
Thanks
night.
so
Thank you.
much.
Good
Thank you for
night.
having us.
Night.